In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where legends are born from blood and bullets, there lived a story that would make even the bravest soldiers question everything they thought they knew about courage. It was a tale of Marcus Chen, a young Marine whose gentle nature earned him mockery from his fellow warriors, whose quiet voice was mistaken for weakness, and whose compassionate heart was seen as a fatal flaw in a world where mercy could mean death. They called him Soft, a nickname that followed him through boot camp like a shadow, whispered in mess halls and barracks with cruel laughter. His drill sergeants shook their heads, his squad mates rolled their eyes, and his commanding officers wondered if this gentle soul had what it took to survive in the brutal theater of war. But, what they didn't know was that behind those kind eyes lay a gift so extraordinary, so precise, that it would soon turn the tide of an impossible battle and rewrite the very definition of what it means to be a warrior. This is the story of how the Marine everyone underestimated became the sniper who saved an entire battalion, taking down a full enemy legion with nothing but his rifle, his training, and a heart that refused to let his brothers in arms die on his watch. It's a story of proving that sometimes the quietest voices carry the deadliest whispers, and that true strength doesn't always roar, sometimes it speaks softly and carries the biggest impact of all. Marcus Chen had always been different from the other Marines in his unit. While his fellow soldiers spent their evenings playing poker, arm wrestling, and sharing war stories, Marcus would sit quietly in the corner of the barracks, writing letters home to his elderly grandmother in San Francisco's Chinatown. His voice never rose above a respectful tone, his movements were deliberate and careful, and he had never once gotten into a fight with another soldier. These qualities, which his grandmother had taught him were virtues, became the source of endless ridicule in the harsh environment of military life. The nickname, Soft, started during basic training at Paris Island. While other recruits screamed their responses to drill instructors, Marcus spoke with quiet confidence. While others threw punches during disagreements, Marcus walked away. The drill instructors pushed him harder than the others, expecting him to break, to show some flash of anger or aggression that would prove he belonged among warriors. But Marcus never broke. He simply endured, completed every task with precision, and maintained his gentle demeanor no matter how much pressure they applied. His marksmanship scores were exceptional from the very beginning. At the rifle range, while other recruits struggled to hit their targets at 300 yards, Marcus was placing perfect shots at 800 yards with an almost supernatural calm. The instructors noticed, but his personality overshadowed his talent. They saw a skilled marksman, but questioned whether he had the killer instinct necessary for combat. In their minds, being soft meant being weak, and weakness had no place in war. When Marcus graduated and was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment, his reputation followed him like a curse. His squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, was a veteran of 3 deployments who believed that Marines needed to be hard as nails to survive. He looked at Marcus and saw a liability. During training exercises, Rodriguez would deliberately put Marcus in the most challenging positions, hoping to toughen him up or wash him out entirely. Marcus's squad mates were no kinder. Corporal Jackson, a hulking man from Texas who could bench press twice his body weight, made it his personal mission to remind Marcus daily that he didn't belong. Private Williams, who came from the rough streets of Detroit, saw Marcus's gentle nature as a sign of privileged softness. They would accidentally bump into him during formation, hide his gear before inspections, and make jokes at his expense during meals. But Marcus never complained. He absorbed their hostility with the same quiet strength his grandmother had taught him. She had survived the Cultural Revolution in China, had lost her husband to war, and had raised Marcus's father as a single mother in a foreign country. Her lessons about inner strength, about the power of stillness, and about the courage it took to remain compassionate in a cruel world had shaped Marcus into the man he was. He understood that their mockery came from their own fears and insecurities about the war they were all heading toward. The unit deployed to Afghanistan in the spring of 2018, assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman in the volatile Khost province. The area was known for frequent Taliban attacks, improvised explosive devices, and sniper fire from the surrounding mountains. It was a place where Marines learned quickly that survival depended on trusting your brothers in arms, and many questioned whether they could trust someone they saw as weak. Marcus was assigned as the unit's designated marksman, a role that seemed perfect for his shooting abilities but isolated him from the tight bonds that infantry Marines typically shared. While his squad mates went on patrol together, Marcus often worked alone or with a spotter, providing overwatch from elevated positions. This separation only reinforced their belief that he was different, that he wasn't really one of them. The first few months of deployment were relatively quiet for Marcus's unit. They conducted routine patrols, searched for weapons caches, and provided security for supply convoys. During this time, Marcus proved his worth in small ways that went largely unnoticed. He spotted an improvised explosive device during a patrol that could have killed 3 Marines. His sharp eyes caught movement in a building that led to the discovery of a Taliban weapons cache. His careful observations helped intelligence officers track enemy movement patterns through the valley. But, his squad mates saw only his quiet demeanor during firefights. While they shouted commands and battle cries, Marcus worked silently, picking his shots with careful precision. While they celebrated kills with high fives and crude jokes, Marcus said nothing, showing what they interpreted as a lack of enthusiasm for the fight. They couldn't understand that Marcus's silence came from a deep respect for the gravity of taking a life, even an enemy's life. The turning point came during a mission in late August. Intelligence had identified a Taliban commander who was coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. The unit was tasked with capturing or killing this high-value target in a small village nestled in the mountains about 20 miles from their base. It was supposed to be a straightforward operation: surround the building where the commander was hiding, call for his surrender, and either capture him alive or eliminate him if he resisted. Marcus was positioned on a ridge overlooking the village, providing overwatch with his rifle while the rest of the squad moved into position. Through his scope, he watched as his squad mates approached the target building under cover of darkness. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until the first explosion shattered the silence of the night. The Taliban commander hadn't been alone. Intelligence had been wrong about the strength of enemy forces in the village. What the Marines had expected to be a simple capture mission turned into a fierce firefight as dozens of Taliban fighters emerged from hidden positions throughout the village. Marcus's squad mates found themselves surrounded and outnumbered, taking fire from multiple directions as they tried to reach cover. From his position on the ridge, Marcus could see the entire battlefield spread out below him. He watched in horror as his squad mates, the same men who had mocked and ridiculed him for months, fought desperately for their lives against overwhelming odds. Sergeant Rodriguez was pinned down behind a low wall, bleeding from a wound to his shoulder. Corporal Jackson was dragging a wounded Private Williams toward the shelter of a destroyed building, both of them exposed to enemy fire. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Marcus could have called for backup and waited for reinforcements to arrive. He could have focused on covering his squad mates' retreat and minimizing casualties. But, as he watched his brothers in arms facing death, something awakened in Marcus that had always been there but had never been needed before. It wasn't the aggressive fury that his superiors had wanted to see. It was something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating determination to protect the people he cared about, regardless of how they had treated him. Marcus began to work with a precision and focus that seemed to slow time around him. His breathing became controlled and rhythmic. His heartbeat steadied. His hands, already steady from years of training, became absolutely rock-solid. Through his scope, he began to identify targets with the methodical patience of a surgeon and the deadly accuracy of a master craftsman. His first shot took down a Taliban fighter who was about to throw a grenade into Sergeant Rodriguez's position. The enemy fighter dropped silently, the grenade rolling harmlessly away to explode against an empty wall. Marcus's second shot eliminated a sniper who had Jackson and Williams pinned down, allowing them to reach safety. His third shot dropped a fighter who was flanking the Marines from the left side of the village. But, this was just the beginning. As Marcus continued to work, his squad mates began to notice something extraordinary happening. Enemy fighters who had been advancing confidently just moments before were suddenly dropping without warning. Positions that had been pouring deadly fire onto the Marines fell silent one by one. The tide of the battle was shifting, and it was shifting because of the Marine they had all dismissed as too soft for war. Marcus worked with a quiet efficiency that was almost supernatural. He never hurried, never panicked, never wasted a shot. Each trigger pull was deliberate and precise, each target carefully selected for maximum impact on the battle. He moved systematically through the enemy positions, eliminating threats in order of priority, always thinking several steps ahead to anticipate where the next danger would come from. The Taliban fighters, veteran warriors who had fought against coalition forces for years, began to realize that something was very wrong. Their carefully planned ambush was falling apart as their numbers dwindled one by one. They couldn't see Marcus on his distant ridge, couldn't identify where the shots were coming from, couldn't understand how their strong positions were being neutralized so quickly and quietly. Down in the village, Marcus's squad mates were experiencing their own revelation. The same men who had questioned his courage, who had mocked his gentle nature, who had doubted his place among Marines, were now witnessing firsthand what real warrior strength looked like. It wasn't the loud, aggressive bravado they had expected. It was quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal. Sergeant Rodriguez, despite his wound, found himself in awe as he watched enemy positions fall silent around him. Corporal Jackson, the man who had made Marcus's life miserable for months, felt a growing respect for the Marine who was single-handedly saving their lives. Private Williams, who had joined in the cruel jokes about Marcus being soft, began to understand that they had all been wrong about what it meant to be strong. As the night wore on and Marcus continued his deadly work, the enemy force that had seemed so overwhelming began to crumble. What had started as a confident ambush by a superior force was becoming a rout as Taliban fighters found themselves being picked off one by an unseen enemy who never seemed to miss. Some began to retreat, others tried to hide, but Marcus could see them all through his scope, and his patience was infinite. The battle that was supposed to end in disaster for the Marine squad was becoming a masterclass in precision shooting. Marcus had found his calling, not as the aggressive warrior his superiors had wanted him to be, but as something far more effective, a guardian angel with a rifle, watching over his brothers from above and eliminating threats before they could cause harm. The gentle young man they had all underestimated was proving that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from anger or aggression, but from love and the determination to protect those who matter most. The night was far from over, and Marcus could sense that something bigger was happening than just the ambush his squad had walked into. Through his night vision scope, he began to notice movement on the far ridgeline surrounding the village. More Taliban fighters were approaching from multiple directions, and the radio chatter he was monitoring suggested that what they had stumbled into wasn't just a trap for his small squad, but part of a much larger operation targeting the entire forward operating base. Marcus keyed his radio with calm precision. His voice, the same quiet tone that had earned him ridicule for months, now carried the weight of absolute authority as he reported his observations to command. The enemy forces converging on their position weren't just local fighters. They were part of a coordinated assault involving hundreds of Taliban soldiers, armed with heavy weapons, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades. The village where his squad was trapped was meant to be the launching point for a massive attack on FOB Chapman that could have resulted in dozens of American casualties. Command's response was immediate but sobering. Reinforcements were at least 2 hours away due to other operations in the region. Air support was limited because of weather conditions that had grounded most aircraft. Marcus's squad, along with Marcus himself, were effectively on their own against a force that was growing larger by the minute. The Marine they had all called soft was now the primary obstacle standing between hundreds of enemy fighters and a successful assault on their base. Marcus absorbed this information with the same calm that had characterized his entire approach to the firefight. He understood that the battle was no longer just about saving his squadmates, though that remained his primary concern. He was now fighting to prevent a much larger catastrophe, and the responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar weight. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that true strength often required carrying burdens that others couldn't bear. From his elevated position, Marcus began to expand his field of view beyond the immediate village where his squad mates were trapped. Using his spotting scope and night vision equipment, he started to map out the enemy positions across the entire valley. What he saw would have overwhelmed most Marines, but Marcus processed it with the methodical patience that had always defined his character. He counted at least 200 enemy fighters spread across multiple positions, with more arriving from mountain paths every few minutes. The Taliban forces had planned their assault with impressive tactical sophistication. They had positioned heavy machine gun nests on commanding heights that could pour devastating fire onto any rescue attempt. Mortar teams were setting up in defilade positions where they could shell FOB Chapman while remaining protected from counter-battery fire. Sniper teams were moving into positions that would allow them to pick off American forces during the daylight hours when the main assault would begin. But, they had made one crucial mistake in their planning. They had assumed that the small Marine patrol they had ambushed would be quickly eliminated, leaving no one to observe and report on their preparations. They hadn't accounted for Marcus Chen, whose unique combination of patience, precision, and determination was about to turn their carefully orchestrated attack into a nightmare. Marcus began to work with the systematic approach of a chess master planning multiple moves ahead. He couldn't simply shoot at every enemy fighter he could see. He had to prioritize his targets based on their threat level to his squad mates, their importance to the enemy's overall plan, and his ability to engage them without revealing his position. Every shot had to count, and every shot had to contribute to disrupting the enemy's larger strategy. His first priority was neutralizing the immediate threats to his trapped squad mates. A Taliban fighter with a rocket-propelled grenade was positioning himself to destroy the building where Corporal Jackson and Private Williams had taken shelter. Marcus's shot took him down just as he was raising the weapon to his shoulder, the RPG round detonating harmlessly against a distant wall. A heavy machine gun crew that was preparing to pour fire onto Sergeant Rodriguez's position never got the chance to fire as Marcus eliminated the gunner and his assistant with two quick, precise shots. But Marcus wasn't just reacting to immediate threats. He was actively disrupting the enemy's entire battle plan. When he spotted a Taliban commander coordinating the movement of multiple squads through hand signals, Marcus eliminated him with a single shot, leaving several groups of fighters confused and directionless. When he identified a communications specialist trying to coordinate the attack with radio equipment, that man became his next target, severing crucial links in the enemy's command structure. The Taliban fighters began to realize that their carefully planned operation was falling apart, but they couldn't understand why. Their casualties were mounting steadily, but they couldn't locate the source of the devastating accurate fire that was picking them off one by one. Some began to suspect that they were facing a much larger American force than intelligence had suggested. Others wondered if there were multiple snipers working in coordination against them. Marcus allowed them to maintain these misconceptions because they worked to his advantage. Confused and demoralized enemy fighters made mistakes, exposed themselves unnecessarily, and often panicked under pressure. He watched through his scope as Taliban commanders tried to reorganize their forces, only to fall victim to his rifle before they could effectively coordinate a response to his attacks. As the hours passed, Marcus's squad mates began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The Marine they had dismissed as too gentle for war was single-handedly dismantling an enemy force that should have overwhelmed them completely. Sergeant Rodriguez, despite his wound, found himself studying Marcus's work with professional admiration. Each shot was perfectly placed, each target selection was tactically sound, and the overall effect was devastating to enemy morale and capability. Corporal Jackson, the man who had made Marcus's life most difficult during training, was experiencing a profound shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. He had always believed that strength came from aggression, that effectiveness in combat required anger and brutality. But, watching Marcus work, he saw a different kind of warrior entirely. Marcus fought with compassion for his fellow Marines, driving every decision, with discipline replacing rage, and with a deadly precision that was far more effective than any amount of fury. Private Williams, despite his own wounds, found himself studying Marcus's technique with growing respect. He had grown up on streets where violence was common and brutal, where survival often depended on striking first and striking hardest. But Marcus was demonstrating a level of controlled violence that was far more sophisticated and effective than anything Williams had ever witnessed. Each of Marcus's actions was calculated to protect his brothers in arms while eliminating threats with maximum efficiency. The radio communications Marcus was monitoring revealed that the Taliban leadership was becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to locate and eliminate the American sniper who was destroying their operation. They had committed significant resources to this attack, including fighters who had traveled from Pakistan specifically for this mission. The failure of their assault would be a major blow to their prestige and capability in the region. Marcus could hear the enemy commanders issuing increasingly desperate orders. Some were calling for immediate withdrawal, others were demanding that their fighters locate and kill the sniper at all costs. A few were trying to salvage the operation by focusing their remaining forces on a direct assault against Marcus's squad mates, hoping to accomplish at least part of their original objectives. These communications gave Marcus valuable intelligence about enemy intentions and locations. He began to target the radio operators he could identify, further disrupting Taliban communications and coordination. Each communication link he severed made it harder for the enemy to adapt to his attacks and respond effectively to the changing tactical situation. But Marcus knew that his ammunition, though carefully conserved, wasn't unlimited. He had started the night with enough rounds for a normal Overwatch mission, not for single-handedly engaging an entire Taliban regiment. He began to calculate his remaining ammunition against the number of high-value targets he could still identify, prioritizing those whose elimination would have the greatest impact on the enemy's overall capability. The mathematical precision with which Marcus approached this calculation was characteristic of his entire approach to the battle. He wasn't fighting in an emotional frenzy or responding to immediate impulses. He was conducting a systematic dismantling of enemy forces using the same methodical patience that had characterized his entire military career. Every decision was made based on careful analysis of the tactical situation and the likely consequences of various courses of action. As dawn approached, Marcus could see that his strategy was working. The Taliban force that had numbered in the hundreds was now significantly reduced, and those who remained were demoralized, confused, and beginning to withdraw from their positions. The carefully coordinated assault on FOB Chapman had been turned into a disorganized retreat, and American lives had been saved not through overwhelming firepower or superior numbers, but through the precise application of skill and determination by a single Marine. But the battle wasn't over yet. The most dangerous part was still to come, as desperate enemy fighters would make their final attempts to salvage something from their failed operation. And Marcus, despite his extraordinary performance throughout the night, was still just one man with limited ammunition facing an enemy force that, while diminished and demoralized, was still capable of causing significant damage if it regrouped effectively. The gentle young man who had entered the military as Marcus Chen was disappearing, being replaced by someone harder and more focused, yet somehow still fundamentally the same person his grandmother had raised. The compassion that drove him to protect his brothers was unchanged, but it was now expressed through the controlled application of lethal force rather than quiet words and gentle actions. He was becoming the warrior he had always been meant to be, not through abandoning his fundamental nature, but by finding a way to channel it toward the protection of those he cared about most. As the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the Afghan mountains, Marcus could see the full scope of what he had accomplished during the long night. The valley that had been swarming with enemy fighters just hours before was now littered with evidence of his deadly work. Taliban positions that had bristled with weapons and fighters were now silent and abandoned. The carefully orchestrated assault that was meant to devastate FOB Chapman had been turned into a complete tactical disaster for the enemy forces. But Marcus knew that dawn brought new dangers. With visibility improving, the remaining Taliban fighters would be able to spot his position more easily. They would also be more desperate, knowing that their window of opportunity was closing as American reinforcements grew closer. Through his scope, He could see small groups of enemy fighters attempting to consolidate their remaining forces for one final push, either to complete some portion of their original mission or to exact revenge for the devastating losses they had suffered. Marcus's ammunition was running critically low. By his careful count, he had fewer than 20 rounds remaining, a number that would have seemed impossible to manage effectively against the dozens of enemy fighters still in the area. But, Marcus had learned something about himself during this long night that even he hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't just an accurate shot or a patient marksman. He had become something far more dangerous, a tactical thinker who could see the entire battlefield as a complex system and manipulate it with surgical precision. His radio crackled with urgent communications from command. Drone surveillance had confirmed what Marcus had been reporting throughout the night. Intelligence estimates now suggested that he had single-handedly eliminated or caused the withdrawal of more than two-thirds of the enemy force that had been assembled for the attack on their base. The operation that should have resulted in massive American casualties had been turned into an intelligence goldmine, with abandoned enemy equipment providing valuable insights into Taliban capabilities and planning. But, command also had sobering news. A final group of Taliban fighters, estimated at about 30 men, had barricaded themselves in a fortified compound at the far end of the valley. Intelligence suggested that this group included several high-value targets, possibly including the regional Taliban commander who had been the original focus of the mission. These fighters had heavy weapons and were prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender or retreat. More concerning was the intelligence that this group had taken several local civilians as hostages, including women and children from the village where Marcus's squad was trapped. They were threatening to execute the hostages unless they were allowed to withdraw safely. The situation had become not just a military engagement, but a hostage rescue operation with innocent lives hanging in the balance. Marcus studied the compound through his scope with the same methodical patience he had shown all night. The structure was well designed for defense, with thick walls, limited approaches, and excellent fields of fire for the defenders. A conventional assault would likely result in heavy casualties among both American forces and the civilian hostages. But, Marcus began to see possibilities that others might have missed. The compound had been built on a slight rise that provided the defenders with good visibility of the surrounding area. But, this same elevation made certain parts of the structure visible from Marcus's position on the distant ridge. More importantly, Marcus had observed the movement patterns of the defenders throughout the early morning hours and was beginning to understand their rotation schedules, their blind spots, and their behavioral patterns. Marcus keyed his radio and began to relay detailed intelligence about the compound to command. His observations were so precise and comprehensive that the intelligence officers receiving them initially questioned whether he might have access to additional surveillance assets they weren't aware of. But, Marcus was simply demonstrating the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his entire approach to the battle. He had identified the likely location where the hostages were being held, based on patterns of guard movement and the defensive positions of the Taliban fighters. He had mapped out the interior layout of the compound by observing how people moved between different sections and where they seemed to spend the most time. He had even identified what appeared to be the command structure among the remaining fighters by watching who gave orders and who followed them. But, most importantly, Marcus had identified the sequence of shots that would be necessary to neutralize the threat to the hostages while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties. It would require precision that bordered on the impossible, timing that allowed no margin for error, and the kind of cold calculation under pressure that few humans were capable of maintaining. Command gave Marcus authorization to proceed, but also made it clear that backup plans were being prepared in case his approach failed. Special forces units were being positioned for a possible assault, and helicopter gunships were standing by despite the continued poor weather conditions. But, everyone involved understood that Marcus's approach offered the best chance of saving the civilian hostages while eliminating the remaining threat. Marcus spent several minutes studying the compound through his scope, memorizing every detail of the structure and the positions of the defenders. He identified 6 separate targets whose elimination would effectively neutralize the remaining Taliban threat while creating sufficient confusion to allow the hostages to escape or be rescued. Each shot would have to be perfect, and the sequence would have to be executed in rapid succession to prevent the defenders from realizing what was happening and retaliating against the civilians. His first target was a heavy machine gunner positioned to fire on any approaching American forces. This fighter also appeared to be in a command position, giving orders to other defenders and coordinating their positions. His elimination would remove the primary defensive weapon while also disrupting the enemy's command structure. Marcus waited patiently for the optimal moment when the target was clearly separated from any civilian hostages and positioned for a clean shot. The shot was perfect, dropping the machine gunner silently and immediately. Marcus immediately shifted to his second target, a fighter who was moving to investigate what had happened to the machine gunner. This elimination prevented the alarm from being raised immediately, buying Marcus precious seconds to continue his sequence. His third target was a sniper positioned to cover the compound's main entrance, whose removal would create an escape route for the hostages. Working with mechanical precision, Marcus eliminated each target in turn. His shots were spaced perfectly to prevent the defenders from understanding what was happening until it was too late to respond effectively. By the time the remaining Taliban fighters realized they were under attack, their defensive capabilities had been systematically dismantled and their command structure had collapsed. The final phase of Marcus's operation was the most challenging. The last few enemy fighters had realized what was happening and were beginning to panic, which made them dangerous to the civilian hostages. Marcus had to make split-second decisions about which targets posed the greatest immediate threat while ensuring that his shots wouldn't endanger innocent lives. His final shots were taken under the most pressure he had experienced all night. Enemy fighters were moving erratically, trying to use the civilian hostages as human shields while also attempting to return fire in Marcus's direction. Marcus had to wait for perfect opportunities when targets were clearly separated from civilians, then make shots that required not just accuracy but impeccable timing. When the shooting stopped, the compound was silent except for the voices of civilian hostages calling out in their local dialect. The final group of Taliban fighters who had represented the last threat to both FOB Chapman and the innocent villagers had been eliminated with the same precision and care that Marcus had shown throughout the entire engagement. As American forces moved in to secure the compound and evacuate the civilian hostages, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that he had been holding at bay for hours. He had fired more shots in a single night than most snipers fired in an entire deployment, and every single shot had been fired with the knowledge that American lives hung in the balance. His squad mates approached his position with a mixture of awe and humility that would have been impossible to imagine just hours before. Sergeant Rodriguez, his wound now treated by the medics who had arrived with the reinforcements, shook Marcus's hand with genuine respect. Corporal Jackson, the man who had made Marcus's life most difficult, could barely find words to express his gratitude and his recognition of what Marcus had accomplished. Private Williams, himself now being treated for wounds that would have been fatal without Marcus's protection, looked at the quiet Marine who had saved all their lives and understood that he had been witnessing something extraordinary. The man they had mocked as too soft for war had proven to be exactly the kind of warrior they needed when the situation was most desperate. Command's final assessment of the engagement would later reveal that Marcus had eliminated more than 150 enemy fighters during the course of the night, effectively destroying an entire Taliban regiment while saving not just his own squad but preventing a major attack that could have resulted in dozens of American casualties. The precision and effectiveness of his shooting had also resulted in the capture of valuable intelligence assets that would contribute to successful operations for months to come. But, for Marcus, the numbers and tactical assessments mattered less than the simple fact that his brothers in arms were alive and the innocent civilians who had been caught up in the conflict were safe. He had discovered something about himself that night that changed not just how others saw him, but how he understood his own capabilities and his role as a Marine. The gentle young man who had been dismissed as too soft for war had proven that true warrior strength came not from aggression or brutality, but from love, discipline, and the determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. His grandmother's lessons about inner strength and compassion hadn't made him weak, they had made him into exactly the kind of Marine the Corps needed most. In the days that followed, word of Marcus's extraordinary knight spread throughout the military community. The Marine who had been called soft became a legend, not because he had abandoned his gentle nature, but because he had found a way to channel it into the most effective kind of warrior strength. His story became required reading at sniper schools, studied by tacticians, and told with pride by Marines who understood that true strength came in many forms. Marcus himself never lost the quiet humility that had defined his character from the beginning. He accepted the commendations and recognition with the same grace he had shown in accepting the earlier mockery and ridicule. But, more importantly, he had found his place not just in the Marine Corps, but in the larger story of warriors who fought not for glory or conquest, but for love and the protection of those who mattered most.